The air in old Judge Harrison's courtroom was thick with a cloying mix of cheap air freshener and palpable greed. It was supposed to be a straightforward probate hearing, the final settling of my beloved Grandpa Joe's estate. Instead, it felt like the public unveiling of a betrayal so profound it stole the breath from my lungs. My name is Maya. I'm 32 now. This story, the one that clawed justice from the jaws of deceit, began 2 years ago, but its roots stretched back to my childhood, to sunny afternoons spent in Grandpa Joe's sprawling, slightly ramshackle farmhouse, the place he always said would one day be mine. He'd passed 3 months prior, a kind, vibrant man whose booming laugh and endless stories were the soundtrack of my happiest memories. I was his only granddaughter, the one who shared his love for the overgrown gardens, the creaky porch swing, and the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over the property. "This house has your heart in its walls, Maya girl," he'd often say, his eyes twinkling. "It's waiting for you." But the will presented by my Aunt Carol, my father's estranged and notoriously grasping older sister, told a different story. She sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her equally avaricious husband, Uncle Marcus, and their 2 smug adult children, my cousins Daniel and Sophie. Their lawyer, a slick character named Mr. Finch, droned on, his voice oozing false solemnity. "And so," Finch concluded, holding up a crisp, official-looking document, "as per Mr. Joseph Carmichael's last will and testament, dated 6 months prior to his passing, the entirety of his estate, including the farmhouse and surrounding lands, is bequeathed to his devoted daughter, Ms. Carol Albright, and her family." A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, rippled through the small gallery of local onlookers and distant relatives. I sat alone at the defendant's table, my own legal aid lawyer, a young, earnest but clearly outmatched man named Ben, looking as stunned as I felt. Devoted? Carol had barely visited Grandpa Joe in the last decade, her calls perfunctory, her interest in him non-existent until his health began to fail. And this new will, it directly contradicted everything Grandpa Joe had ever told me, every promise he'd ever made. It contradicted the older, simpler will he'd shown me years ago, the one naming me as the primary beneficiary of the farmhouse. That will, mysteriously, could no longer be found. "This is a travesty," I whispered to Ben, my hands clenching into fists. "That's not what he wanted. They've lied." Ben shook his head, his expression grim. "The document appears legally sound, Maya. Signed, witnessed. It's going to be hard to contest without concrete proof of undue influence or forgery." Aunt Carol shot me a triumphant, pitying smirk from across the room. Uncle Marcus puffed out his chest. Daniel and Sophie exchanged superior glances. They had won. They had stolen my inheritance, my childhood home, the last tangible piece of my grandfather. The judge, a weary man who had seen too many family squabbles, peered over his glasses. "Ms. Rossi, do you have any evidence to challenge the validity of this will?" My heart sank. Evidence? What evidence could I possibly have against a seemingly legitimate document, against their united front of lies? I thought of Grandpa Joe's kind face, his unwavering love for me. I thought of his booming laugh echoing through the halls of that beloved old house, and a spark of defiance ignited within the despair. He wouldn't have done this, not to me. "Your Honor," I said, my voice trembling but clear, "I believe this will is a forgery, and I believe my grandfather's true wishes were very different." Aunt Carol scoffed audibly. Mr. Finch looked disdainful. "Belief is not evidence, Ms. Rossi," Judge Harrison said, his tone not unkind but firm. "Unless you have something concrete to present, I will have to rule in favor of the submitted will." The courtroom felt like it was closing in on me. The smug faces of my aunt and her family blurred. Was this it? Was this how my grandfather's legacy, his love for me, would be erased? The thought was a cold, sharp knife twisting in my gut. The promise of Judgment Day, the day the truth would out, felt like a distant, impossible dream. The weeks following that initial probate hearing were a blur of frantic research, sleepless nights, and a growing sense of despair. Ben, my legal aid lawyer, was sympathetic, but realistic. Contesting a signed and witnessed will was an uphill battle, especially with limited financial resources against Aunt Carol's well-funded legal team. The pattern of my aunt's behavior was, unfortunately, all too familiar. Carol had always been the black sheep of my father's side of the family, driven by a relentless greed and a deep-seated resentment that she hadn't inherited what she considered her fair share from her own parents. Grandpa Joe, her father-in-law through her marriage to Uncle Marcus, who was my mother's brother, making the family tree a bit tangled but their avarice perfectly aligned, had always been wary of her. He'd seen her manipulate situations for financial gain before, alienating other family members with her grasping nature. Uncle Marcus, weak-willed and easily led by his domineering wife, was her eager accomplice. Their children, Daniel and Sophie, had been raised in their image, entitled and opportunistic. Grandpa Joe had made his intentions for the farmhouse clear to me from the time I was a teenager. After my parents' messy divorce, he had become my anchor, my sanctuary. He'd involved me in every aspect of the old house, teaching me to repair leaky faucets, tend the unruly gardens, even how to identify the birds that nested in the ancient oak. He'd often pull out an old, slightly yellowed document from his roll-top desk, his will, he'd explain, and point to the clause that specifically named me, Maya Rossi, as the inheritor of the farmhouse and its contents. "So you'll always have a place to call home, Maya girl," he'd say, his voice thick with affection. That will was now conveniently missing. Aunt Carol claimed Grandpa Joe had destroyed it when he came to his senses and realized she was the rightful heir. A blatant lie. Grandpa Joe's senses had been perfectly intact, though his body had been failing. In the last year of his life, as his health declined, Carol and Marcus had suddenly become frequent visitors. Their concern had seemed forced, their attentiveness cloying. I, who lived an hour away and visited every weekend, had noticed Grandpa Joe becoming more withdrawn, more anxious after their visits. He'd sometimes hint at pressures, at arguments, but he was a proud man and wouldn't elaborate. I'd dismissed it as the anxieties of an old man facing his mortality, a mistake I now bitterly regretted. My moment of clarity, the point where I knew I couldn't just accept defeat, came during a tearful visit to the now empty farmhouse. Carol had already changed the locks, but I'd stood by the fence, looking at the weathered porch, the overgrown rose bushes, the ancient oak. It felt like a desecration. This wasn't just about a house. It was about my grandfather's memory, his love, his truth. They weren't just stealing property. They were trying to rewrite his legacy, to erase my place in it. That night I remembered something. Grandpa Joe, a lover of gadgets in his later years, had installed a small, motion-activated security camera on the porch, overlooking the front door and a portion of the living room window. He'd said it was to deter local teenagers from occasional mischief. It recorded to a small, hidden SD card. A desperate, improbable hope sparked within me. Could it still be there? Could it have captured anything? The next day, under the guise of collecting a few sentimental items Carol had grudgingly agreed I could retrieve, under her watchful eye, of course, I managed a few precious, unobserved moments on the porch. My hands trembled as I located the small, discreet camera, almost hidden by a climbing vine. With fumbling fingers, I ejected the tiny SD card. It was a long shot, a sliver of a chance, but it was all I had. Back in my tiny apartment, I inserted the card into my laptop, my heart pounding. What I found made my blood run cold, then boil with a righteous fury. The SD card contained weeks, possibly months of footage. Much of it was mundane. Squirrels darting across the porch, the mailman delivering letters, me arriving for my weekend visits, sharing tea with Grandpa Joe on the swing. But as I scrolled through the recordings from the period Carol claimed the new will was signed, 6 months before his passing, a different, more sinister narrative began to emerge. There were numerous clips of Aunt Carol and Uncle Marcus arriving, their faces set in determined lines. I saw them through the living room window, their voices too muffled to discern specific words, but their body language was clear, intense, sometimes heated discussions with Grandpa Joe. He looked tired, stressed, often shaking his head. There were clips of Carol alone with him, leaning in close, her expression a mixture of persuasion and barely concealed impatience. Then, I found it. A recording dated precisely 6 months and 2 days before Grandpa Joe died, the day the forged will was supposedly signed. The video showed Carol and Marcus arriving in the early afternoon. They weren't alone. 2 other individuals, a man and a woman I didn't recognize, were with them. The witnesses, no doubt. The camera angle through the living room window was imperfect, partially obscured by a curtain, but it captured enough. I saw Carol place a document on the table in front of Grandpa Joe. He looked at it, then pushed it away, shaking his head vehemently. His voice, though faint, sounded agitated. Carol leaned in, her voice sharp, insistent. Marcus stood behind Grandpa Joe, a looming, almost menacing presence. The two strangers watched, impassive. For nearly an hour, the silent, pixelated drama unfolded. Grandpa Joe looked increasingly distressed, frail. He gestured weakly, clearly refusing. Then, Carol did something that made my stomach churn. She took his hand, the one not holding his pen, and seemed to guide it towards the paper. He pulled his hand back. There was more intense discussion. He looked utterly exhausted, defeated. Finally, almost imperceptibly, he scribbled something on the document. His head drooped immediately afterward. Carol snatched up the paper, a look of grim triumph on her face. She and Marcus exchanged a quick, satisfied glance. The two strangers signed quickly. Within minutes, they were all gone, leaving Grandpa Joe slumped in his chair, looking smaller and more broken than I had ever seen him. It wasn't a smoking gun proving forgery in the sense of a faked signature, but it was damning evidence of undue influence, of coercion. He hadn't signed willingly. He had been browbeaten, pressured, worn down until he had no fight left. But there was more. I kept scrolling through the footage, fast-forwarding through the subsequent weeks. Then, about a month after the will signing, I found another crucial clip. It was late evening. Grandpa Joe was alone on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the garden. He seemed to be talking to himself, or perhaps to the memory of my grandmother. And then, he looked directly at the camera. His voice was weak, but clear, amplified by the camera's microphone. "Maya girl," he began, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "If you're seeing this, things have gone wrong, terribly wrong." My breath hitched. He knew about the camera's reach. Carol and Marcus, they've been pressuring me, about the house, about everything. He sighed, a ragged, weary sound. "They made me sign a new will. I didn't want to, Maya. You know that. This house, it's always been for you." Tears streamed down my face as I listened to my grandfather's voice from beyond the grave. "I tried to be strong," he continued, his voice cracking. "But I'm old, tired. They wore me down. That new will, it's not my true wish. My true will, the one I made for you, is hidden. In the old oak tree, Maya, in the hollow where you used to hide your treasures as a girl. Find it, and find this recording. It's the only proof I have left." He then described exactly how he'd managed to retrieve the SD card from the camera after they'd left that day, record his message, and then carefully replace it, hoping it wouldn't be discovered by Carol until it was too late for her to erase it, or that I might find it first. He'd planned to tell me about it on my next visit, but his health had taken a sudden, sharp decline before he got the chance. He ended the message with, "Don't let them steal our home, Maya. Don't let them dishonor my memory. I love you." The recording ended. I sat there, stunned, tears blurring my vision. He hadn't just left me a message. He had left me a lifeline, a weapon, a way to fight back. My strategy was no longer about just casting doubt. It was about revealing the undeniable truth, in his own words, through his own eyes. The courtroom wasn't just going to hear my belief. It was going to see and hear my grandfather's reality. This video was the key. This was the evidence that no one expected. This was how his true judgment would finally be delivered. The day of the final probate hearing arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. The small courtroom was even more crowded than before, a buzz of speculation filling the air. Aunt Carol, Uncle Marcus, and their children sat at their table, looking smug and confident, no doubt expecting a swift ruling in their favor. Mr. Finch, their lawyer, shuffled his papers with an air of bored assurance. Ben, my lawyer, looked nervous but resolute. We had spent the last few weeks preparing, ensuring the video footage was properly authenticated and admissible. He had a laptop and a projector ready. Judge Harrison called the court to order. "Ms. Rossi, Mr. Carter," he addressed Ben, "you indicated you have new evidence to present regarding the contestation of Mr. Joseph Carmichael's will. The court is prepared to hear it." "Yes, Your Honor," Ben said, his voice clear and steady despite the tremor I knew he felt. "We have video evidence recorded by Mr. Carmichael himself that directly addresses his true wishes and the circumstances surrounding the signing of the will currently before this court." A surprised murmur went through the courtroom. Aunt Carol exchanged a startled, uneasy glance with Uncle Marcus. Mr. Finch frowned, his composure slipping for the first time. "Proceed," Judge Harrison instructed, leaning forward with renewed interest. Ben dimmed the light slightly and set up the projector. The large screen on the courtroom wall flickered to life. First, Ben played the clip showing Aunt Carol, Uncle Marcus, and the two witnesses pressuring Grandpa Joe. The silent, pixelated figures moved across the screen, their actions telling a clear story of coercion. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Aunt Carol's face turned a mottled red. Uncle Marcus began to sweat. Daniel and Sophie looked horrified, their smugness evaporating. Mr. Finch jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an invasion of privacy. It's circumstantial, unclear." "Overruled, Mr. Finch," Judge Harrison said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "The court will determine its relevance. Continue, Mr. Carter." Then Ben played the second clip. My grandfather's face filled the screen, his eyes looking directly out at the courtroom, filled with sadness and resolve. His voice, weak but clear, echoed through the hushed room. "Maya girl, if you're seeing this, things have gone wrong. Terribly wrong." As Grandpa Joe spoke of the pressure, of being forced to sign the new will, of his true wishes for me to have the house, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. It was as if he were there, speaking directly to all of us. Aunt Carol let out a small, choked sob. Uncle Marcus sank lower in his chair, his face ashen. When Grandpa Joe spoke of the hidden will in the old oak tree and his love for me, I couldn't hold back my own tears. Many in the gallery were dabbing their eyes. The video ended. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the projector. Judge Harrison slowly removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. He looked at Aunt Carol and her family, his expression stern, unreadable. "Mr. Finch," the judge said, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight, "do your clients have any response to this rather compelling testimony from the deceased himself?" Mr. Finch was speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Aunt Carol was openly weeping now, not tears of triumph, but of shame and exposure. Uncle Marcus looked utterly broken. Daniel and Sophie stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "Your Honor," Ben said, "we also have the original will, retrieved from the location Mr. Carmichael described in the video. It clearly names Ms. Rossi as the primary beneficiary of the farmhouse." He presented the older, yellowed document. Judge Harrison examined it. He then looked back at my aunt and her family. Their faces were a mask of guilt and despair. The truth, delivered by the very man they had sought to betray, had undone them completely. The verdict was swift. The newer will was declared invalid due to clear evidence of undue influence and coercion. My grandfather's original will was upheld. The farmhouse, my home, was mine. As the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs, Aunt Carol, Uncle Marcus, and their children filed out, heads bowed, their public humiliation complete. They hadn't just lost a legal battle. They had lost their reputations, their credibility, their carefully constructed facade of respectability. My grandfather's video, the evidence que ninguém esperava ver, that no one expected to see, had delivered a judgment far more profound than any legal ruling. Later that day, standing on the porch of Grandpa Joe's house, my house, the setting sun casting long shadows across the familiar garden, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about winning back a property. It was about honoring my grandfather's memory, about ensuring his true voice was heard. The ancient oak tree stood tall, its leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, as if whispering its approval. Justice, like the deep roots of that old tree, had finally, firmly, taken hold. My grandfather's love and his truth had prevailed.